Welcome to Friday's edition of COVID-19. We've been marking a rise in daily cases since mid this week, and today new infections stand at close to 700. Against this backdrop, Korea's economy appears to be faring relatively better, and we've more on this reality later on in the program. Here first is the pandemic coverage with our Kwon So-ah. Now, so we're ending the work week here in Korea just shy of 700 new infections.
We are, Sunny. So let's take a closer look at the figure. We've got 695 infections reported as of 12 a.m. this Friday, and that includes 674 domestic transmissions and 21 cases from abroad. And we are observing a gradual increase here in infections, with the numbers being in the 600s for the third consecutive day. And the average in domestic infections in the past week now stands at 547. Let's also take a look at where these cases have occurred this Friday. As of 12 a.m., we've got over 200 in both the capital Seoul and Gyeonggi-do province, and also quite a serious increase in infections here in Gyeongsangnam-do province with 44 new cases, and Daegu with 65. And our Kim Sung-yeon will take a closer look at this city in a bit. But before that, let's take a look at some more figures here. We've got a total of 142,852 infections here in Korea, and also 1,969 COVID-19 related fatalities. And as for our vaccination updates, now over 7 million people here in the country have received at least one shot of a COVID-19 vaccine. Meanwhile, the U.S. on Thursday announced its plan to ship its first 25 million vaccine doses to help with shortages abroad, with at least 19 million of those to be supplied through the COVAX facility. And the other 6 million include partners like South Korea, where around 1 million Janssen vaccines are expected to arrive here in the country on Saturday to inoculate military-affiliated people.
Right, and staying with vaccination efforts, so I understand we've marked a new milestone on the global front.
Right, Sunny. 2 billion doses of COVID-19 inoculations have been administered, but that's not equivalent to 2 billion people, or a quarter of the world's roughly 7.9 billion population, as most of these vaccines require 2 shots. Now, the milestone has been achieved around 6 months after the first vaccination campaign started in the UK, followed quickly by countries like the US and Israel. Now, more than half of UK adults have received 2 jabs now. Over half of American citizens got their first one. Volume-wise, China, the EU, and India are giving out the largest number of daily shots. In total, 215 countries and territories are vaccinating its people, while 6 countries have yet to start their vaccination campaign, mostly African nations and North Korea. The wealthiest 27 countries in the world account for almost 30% of global vaccinations. At the current pace, it's expected to take a further 9 months to vaccinate 75% of the world for herd immunity. So let's hope for swift vaccination, because the daily COVID-19 infections are still rising at quite alarming speeds. We've got more than 472,000 infections reported in just a day, and also more than 10,000 people have lost their lives due to COVID-19 in the past day. And we've also got 20 countries here that have at least 1.6 million infections, and also 6 countries with over 5 million cases. And those are the updates I have for now. I'll see you in a bit after the government briefing. Back to you, Sunny.
All right, so thank you for that. Now, for a closer look at the domestic COVID-19 situation and the country's vaccination drive, I have our Kim Sung-yeon here in the studio with me. Welcome, Sung-yeon.
Hello, good afternoon.
Right now, come Saturday, Sung-yeon, we mark day 100 of our inoculation campaign, right?
Right, day 100 on Saturday. So Korea's vaccination campaign is certainly humming along very nicely, we can say, and health authorities expect to achieve its goal of inoculating over 13 million people, or a quarter of the nation's total population, within the first half of this year. Now, this is also thanks to a high vaccine booking rate, which stood at 80.6% in those aged between 60 and 74. Vaccine registration for seniors officially closed on Thursday, but the KDCA said that those who fail to book their appointments in time can still get surplus vaccines either by phoning a clinic or visiting in person. Meanwhile, as of this Friday, more than 7 million people in the country have received at least one dose, accounting for more than 13% of the total population. And in addition, more than 2.2 million people, or 4.3% of the whole population, have been fully vaccinated.
Korea's inoculation campaign is speeding up, and I want to thank you all for making this possible. Through your determination to overcome the pandemic, your trust in vaccinations, your compliance to social distancing measures, and your patience.
In the meantime, 1 million Janssen shots from the U.S. are expected to arrive early Saturday morning as part of Washington's pledge to provide vaccines to Korean military service members. The Janssen doses will be given to reservists, civil defense personnel, and other civilian workers in the military, but those under 30 will be excluded amid concerns over blood clots.
And speaking of concerns, Song-yeon, what is the latest with regard to breakthrough infections here on the local front?
Right, so Korea has confirmed a total of 9 breakthrough infection cases so far. All of these occurred in people who had received 2 Pfizer shots, but experts were keen to note that it does not suggest any flaws in the Pfizer vaccines. The KDCA said on Thursday that 9 cases only represent a negligible proportion of fully vaccinated people, which now stands at over 2 million. It also noted that the figure is much lower than in other countries, including the U.S., where the rate is 10 times higher. While all the breakthrough cases in Korea involve the Pfizer vaccine, the KDCA cautioned against making quick conclusions, saying that 3/4 of all fully vaccinated Koreans received the Pfizer vaccine, so the odds were likely for this to occur.
There are around 3 times as many people who've been fully vaccinated with Pfizer shots compared to AstraZeneca. Therefore, it is possible that we could see a case of breakthrough infection in someone who's received the AstraZeneca vaccine in the days ahead.
The KDCA stressed that because no vaccine is 100% effective, we may continue to see more breakthrough infections in the days ahead. In light of this, the KDCA urged people who've been fully vaccinated to continue wearing their masks when indoors.
Right. Now, also in the headlines, as Suwa mentioned earlier, is the city of Daegu, where authorities are planning to tighten their restrictions, I hear.
Yes, so cluster infections, particularly from nightlife venues over in Daegu, are spreading very rapidly. So it's creating concerns. And the city government did say Thursday it will raise its social distancing level by 1 notch to level 2 on Saturday. The level 2 rules will take effect at midnight Friday and last until June 20th, imposing new restrictions on gatherings and operating hours for businesses. City officials said the move was inevitable due to a recent spike in cluster infections and the rapid spread of variants. Health authorities fear the recent clusters linked to bars and other nightlife establishments may spread out of control. Furthermore, the KDCA said many other cases involved the more transmissible Alpha variant. Take a listen.
There's been a lot of close contact and overlapping infection routes, with people in their 20s to 40s make up 63.6% of infections. To make matters worse, the variant virus is spreading, becoming the dominant strain in this region.
Daegu, Korea's 3rd largest city, added 65 more cases as of Friday 12 a.m. after reporting 74 daily cases in the previous day, which is the highest daily tally seen in more than 1 year. Cluster infections have also been reported at places of worship and workplaces, and variant cases are also on the rise. Hence, health authorities are concerned this could be start of a new wave of infections here in the country.
All right, Song-yeon, as always, thank you very much for that coverage.
My pleasure.
Right, up next, we're poised to join the regular briefing on the COVID-19 situation here in Korea for this Friday. And while we wait for that to start, let's take a look at the incentives for those who have received at least the first dose of the COVID-19 vaccine and have witnessed the passing of 2 weeks. First, these individuals are excluded from the cap of 8 people for family gatherings. This means any family member who has received at least 1 dose, at least 2 weeks prior, will be exempted from the headcount of 8 people for family events. Secondly, access to senior welfare and activity centres is allowed, and for those fully vaccinated, recreational programs such as singing classes is permitted, as is the sharing of meals. Also, in-person visits to nursing homes is possible if one party is fully vaccinated. However, at nursing homes where the vaccination rate for the first dose stands at below 75%, a negative PCR test will also be required. Prior reservations are necessary, and no eating nor drinking is allowed during these face-to-face meetings at nursing homes, and masks remain mandatory. Moreover, those fully vaccinated and working at high-risk facilities such as nursing homes will also be exempted from the regular mandatory screening requirement. The briefing is started. We'll come back to you afterwards.
Let us now begin our regular briefing for June 4th. As for the seniors booking for the vaccinations above the age of 60, here are some updates. And as of June 4th midnight, we have completed the process of the vaccination booking, and starting from the age group of 60 to 74, that is, we have completed the process, and the vaccination reservation rate stands at about 80.6%. And as for the details for each of the age group, we see the age between 60 and 64 standing at 78.8%, and 65 to 69 at 81.6%, and those between the ages of 70 and 74, we have 82.7%. And this booking has been initiated starting from the May, and since then we have been rolling out the incentives for these vaccination recipients on the May 26th, and after then we have seen a rapid surge of such bookings. And as of today midnight, we also have the inoculation rate standing at 13.8% of the population. A total of 7 million people have been receiving their doses, and considering these eligible recipients, we aim and we see and we are confident that we can inoculate our goal of 13 million, or a quarter of the country's population, within the first half of this year. And in particular, as for the seniors above the age of 60, and also through the inoculation of the essential workers, their inoculation will also be one of the aims for the government to achieve our herd immunity going forward and reduce the infection rate. And next, we have some plans for the teachers at kindergartens, pre-K, and also first and second grade at primary schools, and other care providers. We have had a shift in our schedules, and together with the faculty members' schedules, we are going to inoculate them within the summer holidays. And this is in accordance to our meetings that we have conducted with our quarantine officials, and we have been having a new plan to resume offline classes in the second semester. And considering the intervals between the two shots, we will be also aiming to achieve both of the two shots within the summer holidays before we start the second semester. And the Health Ministry, together with the Education Ministry, will send out text messages to those who have already been booked with their vaccination appointments. We will make sure that there are no chaos that are resulted from such a change in our schedule. And in the second and third weeks of June, where we have more than 5 million vaccination appointments have been booked already, we will make sure to ensure a safe vaccination environment. And we will also provide our surplus vaccine sign-ups as well, and these are also expected to increase the amount of doses to be administered, and we will also make sure that there are minimal doses that are thrown out in this process. And we will make sure that we will be swiftly inoculating these people who have already completed the booking process in a speedy manner. And also we could see some slight changes in the schedules for these eligible recipients. And if this is the case, we will provide the notices in advance. And as for the supply of vaccines, as of today we also have the last batch scheduled for the first half of this year as for the AstraZeneca vaccines, and 877,000 doses have been shipped out from the factory. And this makes that about 13.8 million doses have been fully supplied as scheduled. And as for the Janssen vaccines, 1 million vaccine doses are set to arrive in South Korea early tomorrow. And this is in part of the South Korea-US summit. And also we have some updates on the cross-inoculation of these vaccines. And here in Korea, we have also carried out the cross-vaccination studies, first shot being AstraZeneca and the second shot being Pfizer. And as for the medical professionals, about 100 of them who have been administered with the first dose of AstraZeneca and the second dose of Pfizer, we have been looking at these antibodies and any adverse effects. And after 2 weeks have passed since the second inoculation, we will be looking at the neutralizing antibodies, and going forward, we will also look at the long-term assessment as well. And yesterday, as for the vaccination booking for seniors, we have reached our goal of 80% vaccination rates. And we would like to extend our deepest appreciation for all of our senior citizens who have been partaking in this process based on your trust in the government as well as our medical professionals. And please note that these age group have higher risks of fatalities when they are infected with COVID-19. So it is very important that you get inoculated, and we will also exert our full efforts to give out vaccines in a safe manner. And also in the earlier in these 2 months, we have also upgraded our target for the first half from 12 million to 13 million, and we see that about 13.3 million people can be inoculated within the first half of this year. And when the 1 million vaccine doses of Janssen are also given out, we see that this will be about 14 million people in the first half of this year, and we can expedite our return to pre-pandemic routines. And since the beginning of the vaccination drive, tomorrow marks the 100th day. And we would like to also once again highlight the importance of solidarity and unity amongst our citizens. And also the quarantine effects that have been resulted out from the social distancing. We highly expect that these will also be proven through your participation in the vaccination progress. And going forward, there are many people who are working at the front lines, including those who are moving and transporting the vaccines, and also people who are giving out the vaccines, and also many other volunteers. And we ask you to also send your words of encouragement as well. Thank you very much.
Right, there was Seong Young with Friday's afternoon briefing. So what was the gist of her address?
Well, first off, there's been a slight revision to the vaccination schedule when it comes to instructors or teachers at daycare centers, kindergartens, and also first and second graders at elementary schools, teachers for those grades. So they were expected to be inoculated this month, but now it looks like these teachers will receive their shots during the summer break in July with other teachers together. So for a safe return of students by the end of August for their second semester. So the KDC is saying that the Education Ministry and the Health Ministry will make sure to inform those subjects subject to these vaccinations so that there will be no confusion due to this revision. And also there are some studies underway regarding cross-inoculation so that we might be able to receive the first shot with the AstraZeneca vaccine and then the second shot with the Pfizer vaccine. So those studies are underway as well. And she also again mentioned that the vaccination process is going smoothly, with the government expecting more than 13 million people to be vaccinated in the first half of the year.
I see. All right, so thank you for that.
Thank you.
연내 인상 여부는 결국 경제 상황의 전개에 달려 있습니다.
경기의 확실한 반등과 코로나 격차 해소를 위해 확장 재정 기조를 유지할 필요가 있다고 봅니다. 추가 세수를 활용한 추가적인 재정 투입 가능성을 열어두어야 하겠습니다.
Korea has been weathering the pandemic relatively better than its global partners, with its economy forecast to expand between 3 and 4% this year. Now, for more on this outlook, I have Professor Song Soo-young from Chungang University. Welcome back, Professor Song.
Thank you for having me here.
And I also have Professor Yang Hee-dong from Ewha Women's University. Good to see you again, Professor Yang.
Thank you. Nice to see you again.
And joining this session virtually is Dr. Vincent Kuhn at the OECD. Pleasure to have you with us again, Dr. Kuhn.
감사합니다.
Right then, Professor Song will start here. The BOK, the Bank of Korea that is, boosted its 2021 growth forecast for the country to 4% from an earlier estimate of 3%. What is fueling this optimism?
Behind that, actually, the recovery of world trade has been much better than expected. And also the vaccination has been accomplished quite well among the countries, except some countries have still suffered from the resurgence of the COVID-19 in India and Brazil or other countries. But the most global trade partners with Korea has been improved quite a lot, and in China and in the US and other countries. So that's why that is a primary reason we have Bank of Korea, and including OECD, has revised the forecast to a much better situation. And also the pent-up consumption, which has been suppressed during the outbreak of the coronavirus in Korea. And now we are on the recovery of the consumption. And so that's why that has been reflected. The first half of the 2021 actually expected to see very good improvement in the world trade and export, as well as in the other half in 2021, we expect the full recovery of the domestic demand. So that is going to be a primary factor that determines the revision of the forecast of our economy.
Right, and staying with the optimism, Dr. Kuhn, your entity, the OECD, has also raised its forecast for Korea this year to 3.8%. Do you tell us more about this upgrade?
Sure. Our new projection is very close to that of the Bank of Korea. It's almost within the rounding error distance. The 0.2% difference is negligible in our profession as forecasters. And one important reason for the upward revision is the incoming data. The first quarter was much stronger than we expected back in March when we did our previous projection. And this first quarter has, of course, a sizable carryover effect for the year as a whole. And then the second reason, as just pointed out rightly by Professor Song, is that the world economy is doing better than expected. We now see it expand at 5.8% in 2021, And this is borne out by the incoming data, notably the latest global PMIs, which were released this week and which point to a boom in the second quarter of this year. So that will contribute to boost Korean exports, which have been very strong lately, notably in electronics, but also in a number of other sectors. And exports account for 40%, over 40% of the GDP in Korea. So this is a major contributing factor driving the recovery. I would like to underline, however, that we need to bear in mind that the global economy is still, the global outlook is still surrounded by risks. The momentum of the recovery will be conditioned in large part by how fast and how effectively vaccinations are rolled out and the pandemic is getting under control. The recent disappointing news from Taiwan, which did very well last year on this front but is now facing a surge of infections, shows that we cannot be complacent.
Right. Now, keeping in mind what has been shared thus far, Professor Yang, what are your prospects on the 4% forecast by the BOK? That would be the highest in 11 years if realized.
Well, I actually want to share all the optimism with Professor Song and the expert. There are a lot of international and domestic economic institutions, made very promising predictions of the economic conditions. Sometimes I should say that even the domestic institutions are rather conservative because they had estimated that we will record low 3, the point of economic growth. The major driver for this optimism is again the export. For example, in May we had about 45% of growth compared to last year. And in April, we have about 41% of growth in export. And this is the biggest growth in the last 35 years. And if you take a look at the contents of the export growth, you can even develop even the higher optimism for our future economic growth because, semiconductors and automobiles and petrochemicals, which have been our major elements, items for the export, have taken up major roles for this growth. Their growth rate is above 25% in semiconductors, more than double in automobiles. So yes, why don't we have the higher the optimism for the future growth of economics and export?
Professor Song, you mentioned domestic demand earlier on, getting back on track in the second half of this year. Could you tell us a bit more about the status of domestic demand here in the country?
Yeah, actually, currently, the first half, we have not seen such a very big jump in the recovery of the domestic demand. But according to the report confidence index about the future, what would be the future? But particularly in Korea, the consumers' confidence index is a little bit higher than 50%, which means a positive aspect is expected, but still it is quite lower than the other countries who have suffered from the coronavirus and then on the path to the recovery. Whereas the business people's confidence index is a little bit higher than consumers in Korea. So to that regard, I have our people has been a little bit pessimistic about the future, but still it is on the area of positive. So that could be the reason why we have not witnessed the full recovery of the consumers in first half. But in the second half, we expect that. Dr. Kian has mentioned that Taiwan case is a very good example, the potential risk in front of us, because we have been very successful to contain the coronavirus spread out. So therefore, that's why we have been a little bit, the vaccination has been low, in the low percentage than other countries, because other countries are actually in emergency situations. So that's why they just require huge import of the vaccination and spread out those vaccines to the people. But now Israel, even though they have suffered so much from the more than 10,000 people has been contracted during the outbreak in last year, but currently now the 55% of people in Israel has been vaccinated. So Taiwan case is really, we have to be very careful about Taiwan has been successful, then that has maybe they remained complacent about the situation, then they suffered from sudden resurgence. That could take place in whatever countries for example, India or Brazil, still they are suffered from that. So unless we have those situations in the second half, I think the people's confidence would be improved and our domestic consumption would be on the right path to the
hopefully
full recovery.
Right. Professor Yang, meanwhile, consumer prices rose 2.6% in May, marking the fastest growth here in the country in 9 years. How do you explain this trend?
Well, we had about 2.3% growth for the CPI in April and another 2.6% growth in May. And those two numbers from the outlook may look pretty high, whereas in US the CPI was 4.2. But I think this number is pretty tricky because this is the number compared to the last year. But if you compare these numbers compared to the last month in April, I mean, they're almost the price levels remain pretty flat. So compared to last year, the oil prices have increased and the grocery items have also increased. Those are two major factors that have driven and pushed the price indexes. But now, there are many reasons for the growth of the oil prices and also the harvest of the fresh vegetables. But I do believe that the oil prices remain pretty flat. I mean, around the $60 this year. And there are many, like ESG. I mean, has been the major, the framework for a lot of enterprises to take care of the environment. So due to all this brand new environment, I do believe that we will realize a very handsome harvest of the agricultural items, and oil price remain pretty flat. And again, our vaccine rate is pretty low. The fully vaccination ratio is about 4%, which is a little low than the world average. But our first round of vaccine is higher than the average. And the more important thing is the growth speed is a lot faster. I mean, we have a very exponential growth of vaccinations. I do believe that our economic conditions and price index remain pretty handsome, for a while.
Right. Now, Dr. Kun, concerns over inflation are evident across OECD nations. Is this a passing phenomenon, or does it signal the start of a sustained trend, Dr. Kun?
Well, this is indeed a very hot question these days. In the US, as Professor Yang rightly mentioned, the latest CPI reading in April was over 4%, even though the inflation index monitored by the Fed, which is the PCE, the core PCE, was at only, I would say, over 3%. And in the euro area, CPI inflation has reached 2%, which we haven't seen in a very long time. Well, is this bad news or good news? In a sense, it's good news because we have worried for many years about deflationary pressures in many OECD countries, and now we're seeing some signs of inflation. And in fact, the new framework of the Federal Reserve, which averages this inflation over time, would imply that a temporary overshoot of inflation is actually welcome. But at the same time, we don't want to go back to the experience of the 1970s. And so central banks need to remain very vigilant, as always. In the case of Korea, the overshoot of the 2% target, as Professor Yang mentioned, the latest reading in May was 2.6% for the headline CPI over a year ago. This largely reflects base effects, and these base effects will fall out later this year, as will the temporary supply bottlenecks that are driving this high inflation number. And as Professor Yang rightly emphasized, this is over a year ago, and not month on month. If we look at month on month, looking through volatility also, then the numbers are less worrisome. Also, and lastly, I would like to underline that core CPI inflation, that means excluding the very volatile energy and food prices, while it has risen since the start of the year in Korea, it only stands at 1.2% at the moment, year on year.
Right. Now, given Professor Song the concerns over possible inflation, what are the chances of a hike in interest rates, and what would be the implications of such a hike on economic recovery, do you think?
Yeah, I fully agree with Dr. Kim's diagnosis and analysis of the observed the data. The CPI, why we have observed such a high CPI is because, as Dr. Kim mentioned, is base effect. One of the main reasons is base effect, because we have suffered so much from almost a deflation situation in last year. in the wake of the outbreak of the coronavirus. So that is the main reason. Another reason is the current situation. Even we have observed some surging of the commodity price, such as oil price and other copper price has recovered very high. So is it long-term effect? Does it have a long-term effect? I don't think so, because this is just a temporary blip of the inflation. Because now we have witnessed the once pent-up demand has been in the recovery, and so the supply side cannot keep up with some outburst of the consumption demand. So that is the main reason why we have seen that we cannot, maybe some people has complained of we cannot find enough workers. So that is another reason. So the governor of Bank of Korea has mentioned that as early as next year January would be they would consider some hiking of the interest rate, because he is mainly concerned about the maybe overheating might hamper the recovery of the economy. But I think the reason is because, as I mentioned earlier, the first half we have not, our domestic demand has not fully recovered. But in the second half, without any problems in such as as long as there is no resurgence of the corona or other things are going well, then domestic demand will be in the very high demand. So in that case, maybe we should remain alert, but I don't think we don't need too much worry about the overheating, because even though Dr. Keon has mentioned that even though there is overshooting, still it will be attenuated, or it will be go back to normal situation. So that's why we don't have to be too much concerned, and overreaction would not be good for the economy.
Right. And staying with that, Dr. Kun, what words of advice would you care to share on Korea's monetary policy?
Well, the monetary policy stance is clearly accommodative at this time, as it should be. And the Bank of Korea has kept its policy rate at 0.5% since May last year, providing abundant liquidity. In our view, the stance needs to remain accommodative for the time being and to support the recovery alongside the fiscal measures. And it's also important to note that at 0.5%, the policy rate is already above the lower bound, unlike in many other large OECD economies, not to mention that Korea has not engaged in quantitative easing. So the starting point in Korea is a bit different from what it is in the euro area, in the UK, or in Sweden, say. The exact timing of the next hike, that's always the question that markets are fretting about. It should, of course, be data dependent. For now, there's no rush, we would say. And if indeed inflationary pressures abate, as Professor Song also expects, then the Bank of Korea has some time before initiating its first move up.
Right. Professor Yang, meanwhile, as part of efforts to rev up domestic demand, the ruling party is calling for emergency relief funds for the entire nation. What are your thoughts on this?
Well, I do believe with the recent government decision to give out the emergency relief funds to the entire population, because so far there have been 4 rounds of the giving out of the emergency relief funds, but only the first case was giving out this fund to the entire population, where the second, third, and fourth rounds of the funds gave to very selectively to like small and medium-sized enterprises or very poor house incomes, etc. Why I do agree with the government decision, because there are a couple of reasons behind this, the choice. The first one is this is summer, and everyone wants to go out to vacation. And our big holiday, Chuseok, is very close to the summer, because we have Chuseok holiday, Thanksgiving holiday in September. So in other words, there should be continuation of this mood and psychology, whether we are happy with the government policy or not. So summer and very close Chuseok will be a continuum for the satisfaction or our posture toward the government policy. And second reason is, we have less than 1 year to have another national vote for the next president. So this is a very critical moment. And besides, the opposite party is, experiencing a very dramatic the changes in terms of their governance. So I do believe the ruling parties and the bullet house are pretty much concerned and very nervous about the recent turmoil in economic situations. So they may look for some, great challenge and stimulus to overturn all this environment.
Right. Dr. Kun, the Moon administration believes an expansionary fiscal stance is necessary to ensure economic rebound amid the pandemic, but some have voiced concerns over fiscal health. What are your thoughts?
Well, the OECD view is that member countries, including Korea, should beware of reverting to normal policy settings too quickly. We are still in a pandemic, and fiscal support remains necessary this year, as just highlighted also by Professor Yang. And that said, I want to keep in mind that the projected fiscal deficit for Korea this year is on the order of 4% of GDP, which is much, much lower than the average 10% of GDP plus deficit in other OECD countries. Even so, we at the OECD, like the Ministry of Finance in Sejong, worry about fiscal sustainability, especially for countries like Korea, where aging will exert a substantial fiscal pressure over the longer run. Of course, interest rates are very low at the moment, so debt service has declined in many countries despite rising debt ratios, but we should not be complacent. Down the road, interest rates might move back up, and that would weigh on public finances. I would also highlight that Korea is thinking about putting in place some fiscal rules, both for the debt and for the deficit, which are meant to address this issue. And once they become operational, perhaps in the mid-2020s, they should help guide policy and ensure a degree of fiscal prudence.
Right. Also, Professor Song, back here in the country, of course, unemployment has also been a concern. What measures do you believe are necessary to address it?
Actually, our employment to population ratio has been hovering around the 60%. In the wake of the coronavirus, it has been reduced to 59.6 percentage points. Now it's on the recovery, but clearly we have to be very careful about in diagnosis of these observed data is because it is always combined with some digitalization. So I always emphasize when we remove those effects, then then we can see what is the pure impact on the unemployment rate. And also, as Dr. Keon says, our fiscal deficit against the GDP is increased by 4%, which is much lower than the other OECD countries. So, as Professor Yang has mentioned, some political concerns could be the source, but I really want that the economy should be we should not consider the effect of the political situation. So clearly the opposite party would like to, the better performance economy is definitely favorable to those opposition party to regain their power over the country. So that is my concern is that because of the over-caution and the over-concern might lead to some recovery of the economy into failure. So that is my concern. So we don't have to be too much over-conservative, but of course I agree with we must be careful about avoiding the complacency, but Bank of Korea will not remain as complacent as the Federal Reserve in 1970s in the US or in 1929s. So that is history. Of course, we must get the lesson from that event, but still, Bank of Korea and we are almost all the economists are very concerned, and so as long as we are vigilant, then we don't have to too much worry about this overheating of the economy.
Right. And Professor Yang, what do you propose to ensure a tangible rebound, economic rebound, that is, to pre-pandemic levels?
Vaccination. Well,
Right.
that a lot of economic institutions have adjusted their economic forecast upward to, like, for example, in Korea, in the early year, a lot of institutions estimated like low threes, but now they increased their estimation by 0.5. what's the major reason for the adjustments of vaccination? Our vaccination rate is still very close to India. That has been suffered a lot from this disaster. So we need to increase our vaccination rate. But again, as I said, our speed, the pace of vaccination is getting very fast. So that's why a lot of institutions have changed their attitudes a lot more favorable, positive about the economic growth. Let's see what happens. But I do believe that our economic condition will be recovered, fully recovered before this year, as close to before the pandemic period.
Right. Thank you for your optimistic
Thank you.
words. Professor Yang and Professor Song, as always, thank you for your thoughts. And Dr. Kun over in Paris, thank you very much for making the time to join us live at this hour with your thoughts. Right then, not only do COVID-19 vaccinations look to ensure a return to some form of normality, but also a rebound in economic activities. Have a safe weekend. See you on Monday.